But I want to bring in my guest, the man of the moment, the one and only international relations and security analyst. We're joined with Mark Sleboda. Mark, my man, this morning. You doing okay?
Tomorrow, I'm alive. How are you? Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
I am also alive, thankfully. I got to dig into the first thing that's up. There's apparently a conference that's going to take place in Riyadh. That conference is going to take place with Marco Rubio, Sergei Lavrov. I always say Lavrov is a consummate diplomat. The man is fantastic in that role. So he is going to Riyadh tomorrow, apparently, in order to come up with some kind of talks between Putin and Donald Trump. We also had the call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that took place, I believe, on Friday, if not Thursday, maybe even Wednesday, but last week. And in the readout from the talks between Rubio's department and Lavrov's department, they talk about normalizing relations, effectively not just the Ukraine conflict, but effectively the world. I want your take on this, because I think you and I are starting to disagree on this, and which is good, right? You've been right all the way through, so I could be talking on my ass. It seems like Trump is serious.
Well, I wouldn't say I've been right about everything.
Right. It seems like Trump is serious. That's all I'm getting.
I'm more aware of my mistakes, maybe, than you are. But okay, so I mean, there's unquestioned that Trump wants to improve relations with Russia. There's absolutely no question, and there's increasingly no question that he wants to do it yesterday. Mm-hmm. We have heard from his negotiation team, particularly from former General Keith Kellogg, that they actually want all of this Ukraine business, right, settled, meaning an end to the conflict in Ukraine. He said not in 6 months, but in days and weeks. Wow, mm-hmm. That is a timetable that I'm sure when the Kremlin heard it, it probably took them aback, because they're certainly not expecting that at all, and may not be very well amenable to it either. It must be said. There's so much news on the diplomatic front coming out, and it's all interesting, and it all points in a lot of, shall we say, tantalizing directions. And I think that the most important thing is not to go too premature in making assessments of where this is all going. So yes, to the absolute shock and horror of most of the leaders of Europe,
yes,
it appears from what we know thus far, the signals are largely that the Trump administration wants to, I wouldn't say normalize U.S.-Russia relations. I'm not so sure that normalizing U.S.-Russia relations and how far they've fallen is possible, but normalize them, shall we say, as much as is feasibly, humanly possible. Now, one of the things that came directly from Trump's mouth is that he wants Russia back in the G7, making it the G8 again. And I mean, Europe just lost their feces over this when he said that, right? Because as far he says that Russia should have a voice at the table. Well, that's not the way the Europeans view it at all. They think it's their table, and they don't want to sit at a table with Putin. I mean, they hate Putin. PDS, Putin derangement system, right? Is full scale, but of course, it's Russophobia on a level that goes perhaps even beyond the level of Putin personally, although that's certainly the epitome of it. Now, it has to be said that Russia has made perfectly clear before. This matter was raised years ago already, and Russia made clear they have no interest in the G8. They think it's a useless format, which it is. It's a talking shop. And any talking shop between the rest of the G7 and Russia would mostly be a talking at Russia shop, which would be even more intolerable. They view it as a useless organization. They are focused much more on the G20 as an economic dialogue format, because the G8 just is kind of economically irrelevant when so much of the world's economy concerns the Pacific and growing other parts of the world. They just don't see the point of it. So they're focused on the G20 and increasingly even more so BRICS. And they're simply not interested in that format. As a talking shop, it doesn't meet their interest. So they've already made clear in the past that they have no interest in rejoining that. So if that's supposed to be some of the carrot that the team Trump is dangling in front of Russia, like, well, let's say that you release any claims to Herr Son, and you can rejoin the G8. I don't know if it's that kind of horse trading being done. Like it's some kind of gift being, right? I mean, originally creating the G8 was intended like that, as a gift to Boris Yeltsin to get him to swallow NATO's expansion back in the day, right? That is not something that the Russian government will in any way, shape, or form accept. And even if it was completely strings attached, like just hang out with my friend Trump and my other friends in those other G6 countries and chat. That's not of, I don't think that's of any interest to Putin. So, but it really does indicate that the Trump administration is already operating in a completely different diplomatic world than the rest of Europe, and certainly more so that different than the previous Biden administration.
Now, to be clear, just to interject real quick, Trump acknowledged that NATO expansion was the issue. Trump acknowledged that not just NATO expansion, that Russia would never accept this idea of the line of NATO moving even beyond Vladimir Putin. Okay, that's mind-blowing. No U.S. president, or at the very least in recent years, has admitted that. And he even pointed out, look, Russia is not going to accept a war starting back in 6 months, which means that it needs to be this kind of overarching European architecture. And I want to play something else. This is a British cat coming to terms with the reality of Trump. And listen to what he says. The bastards are putting this over our heads, meaning Europe is not included in the negotiations, nor is Ukraine. I'm fascinated by this. I want to get your take also.
Talking to people in the defense establishment, what I'm hearing are things like this. They, the US administration, are doing this above Zelensky's head. And on the overall approach, which is that no way will Vladimir Putin get all he wants, which is Ukraine, but Vladimir Zelensky will lose a huge amount of Ukraine. This is what I'm hearing of the US administration. The bastards are going to do this.
The bastards are going to do this. The bastards are going to do this. Now, from their point of view, they're going through with this. Zelensky is not included in these negotiations. Europe is not included in these negotiations. They are having a collective shit fit, as you pointed out. Yeah. That's why I look at this and I say, they seem to think it.
I think that they are as premature and perhaps blowing what the end game of this is, at least with regards to Ukraine, out of proportion to a similar level that I think some people on the alt media side are doing as well. And all I'm going to say is, right, I mean, there's all kinds of indications. I would say that it's even okay now for other people out there, not me, because I don't do that, but to have some hope.
Hopium.
Yeah, don't get carried away, though. Exercise some restraint, some patience. Be like Putin. Be chill. Be cold-blooded. Be pragmatic, right? So let's address a couple of things. First, this was said outright by the former General Keith Kellogg again, when asked in Munich by reporters, and he said that the EU, the countries of Europe, have no place at the table in these discussions.
Just
outright.
Wow. Just
I mean,
wow.
that just. So Macron has actually called an emergency meeting of European leaders so that they can all get together and bitch and gripe together about this and do nothing, because there's really nothing that anyone can identify that they can effectively do. I mean, they're making all sorts of threats about just going to war with putting troops on the ground. Going to war with Russia is increasingly being heard by figures in the UK and everyone knows they can't do it without the United States. So no one knows, what they can't even carry the burden. Even with the United States, NATO was losing in Ukraine. With and without the United States, get out of here, right? I mean, that's just, at that point, Europe does not become a contest. EU support for Ukraine simply becomes a speed bump, right? On the road to the finish line. So another thing that has come up, and even apparently there's not clear how much of a seat at the table the Kiev regime will actually have either, right? Like it appears they're not meeting with Putin and Trump. Now, Zelensky says he's going to Saudi Arabia the day after. Maybe as we heard from the end of the Putin-Trump phone call to the Trump-Zelensky phone call, so that Trump can fill him in on what they agreed, right? I mean, that seems to be it. So certainly there's panic and fury in Brussels, panic and desperation in Kiev. Now, there was an interesting phone call between the Russian foreign minister and the American Secretary of State, initiated by Rubio, by the U.S. Secretary of State. And the interesting thing, particular one, is the way they were talking about relations between the two countries in matters that went well beyond Ukraine, right? Of discussing really what should have been happening all these other 3 years, that the U.S. and Russia should have still had a diplomatic dialogue, because these two countries, right, the two largest nuclear armed countries in the world, right? It's pretty clear now the countries with the two largest largest and effective conventional forces in the world, and two of the four largest economies in the world, the U.S. at number 2, Russia coming in at number 4. I mean, these are, the fact that things can happen in the world and the two leaders of these countries don't even have diplomacy and talk to each other over all of the crises that are occurring around the world means that, everything, the tension and the ability to energize any type of real international response, right, from an actual world community becomes nothing. So we know from the readout between Rubio and Lavrov that they want to improve relations, and they want to at least engage with each other across a whole host of issues around the world. But the Russian readout went further. And the Russian readout, not the American readout, although it didn't contradict it, it didn't touch on it, seemed to suggest that, at least from the Russian point of view, it seems that the U.S. wants to remove all the obstacles, including the economic obstacles that were arranged, as they put it, by the previous administration. Never mind that they were also put in place by the previous Trump administration as well. that little detail was left out. But sanctions, right? That as much as is possible, because a lot of it would have to go through Congress, and obviously the sanctions put in place by Europe are not automatically removed by whatever the U.S. president does, although you could argue that inevitably it will be as well.
They'll wag their tails.
Yeah, that at least on the American side, this is purely part of this sweetener, this normalization, is they want to remove sanctions as much as possible on Russia, Russian energy, other things. And of course, as I have said previously, that is not actually on the priority list of ending the Ukraine conflict for Russia. But doubtless it would be welcome. The important thing, however, remains, are the rest of the terms met? Now, we've heard from Hegseth and we've heard from Kellogg that the Kiev regime will have to make territorial concessions. The most important thing there is what are the extent of those concessions that the Americans have in mind. Like Crimea, I mean, that seems to me to absolutely be off the table, as is the Donbass. Do the Americans. But further, Russia has made perfectly clear, even in the last 24 hours, reiterating that there will be no concessions on Kherson or Zaporozhye either. Lavrov said outright that we will not make any territorial concessions on any lands where there are Russian people, meaning in Ukraine. So that could be interpreted as even going beyond the four regions: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, and Donetsk. We don't know what. I mean, Russia could be talking the entire east bank of Ukraine, right? And the United States could mean, all right, Crimea, and we can agree to disagree on Donbass. I mean, that's we don't know what that level is. We also don't know about things like what kind of guarantees they will give and how they will be codified legally to ensure that not only is NATO off the table for Ukraine, or Ukraine is off the table for NATO, however you want to take a look at it, but also that there's no de facto NATO, that the arming, the training, Western military bases don't happen in Ukraine, that there are no Western military troops in Ukraine, right? Because Russia will accept none of that, and nor should they at this point, because they're winning. But there's also things like the restoration of Russian, or shall we say, Russian language rights in Ukraine, and the cultural rights, the political rights of East Ukrainians, the ending of the persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church by the regime, which has been conducting a pogrom against it. Those are all big, no gray area, red line issues for Russia as well. And then you get to the other two issues, the issues of demilitarization, which would include agreeing on the size and purpose of any future Ukrainian state's military, right? Because Russia wants it reduced to a very limited amount by decree. And also on the issue of the denazification, I think better termed as the debanderization of Ukraine, which, to be frank, I do not at all believe that that is possible without regime change in Kiev. Now, they are also seem to be pushing towards elections in Ukraine, right? Now, we've heard from the former oligarch.
Poroshenko is saying October.
Petro Poroshenko saying that this is going to happen on October. Right. But any, quote, elections held by this regime, with all the political parties of East Ukraine still banned, the leaders of the opposition parties still wanted for treason and persecuted, and all media in the country taken over by the unified information policy with all critical voices. How can you have elections? I mean, those aren't real elections, right?
Wait, real quick on that one, on the election front. Yeah, I saw that Poroshenko was effectively saying October. But how much territory has Russia taken? Meaning, how much of East Ukraine is even left to participate in elections, if they did have elections?
Oh, I mean,
let's say they were fair elections.
Yeah. First of all, it's important to remember that not all the Donbass is taken yet, right?
Right.
And probably won't be taken, even if everything continues on the battlefield, before the end of the year, right? I mean, they can still hold out in these last defensive positions, Pokrovsk, Seversk, and the last defensive line, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, it could take Russia the rest of the year to take
I
that,
see.
right?
I see.
Then you have the fact that when we're talking Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, the biggest cities in each of those regions, Kherson City and Zaporozhye City, are still in the Kiev regime's hands. Then you have the question of Odessa, and all of the regions to the south there. There's 2 regions down there. You also have Dnipropetrovsk, which is on the east bank, a highly populated and industrial section. And then you have Chernigov and Sumy, right, in the north section there. So yes, there's still a large portion of what you can consider eastern Ukraine, right, or at least east of Dnieper. So there's that there. So, I mean, there's so much. I just don't know how even Trump can agree to those things. I really don't. If he did, I mean, well, then, of course, but I just don't see. I think people within his own administration would kill him if he gave in to all of Russia's demands like that. Like Waltz himself would finish him off, right? I mean, I just, the neocons would never accept that. I don't believe.
Oh,
but,
man.
I mean, who knows? We'll see. We'll see.
We will see. Fair enough. I just
see.
don't get the sense that he cares.
Now, there are other caveats here, because Kellogg was specifically asked about what concessions he expects the Russians to make. Right. And he did mention territorial concessions, which I take it to mean, right, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and at the very least. Right. But he also said that Trump, and the Trump administration want Russia to give up their alliances with North Korea, Iran, and China.
I saw that and I thought, okay, this is nonsense.
Yeah, it is. I mean, like, sure, Putin be like, yeah, okay, sure, I agree with that. Pinky behind my back. Let's do a photo op. Hey, I gotta go. I've got a quick date with not Xi Jinping, right? It's just laughable. But that's obviously the mentality that they're going for. Is they want to reverse things. Oh, I don't know, to 2001.
Yes.
And
well, then they do want.
Yeah,
I think they see the world changing against them in a way that the Biden administration did.
They want Russia to rejoin the West against China, right? That is not going to happen, right? Even if Putin plays Trump like a chump, right, and makes all sorts of rhetorical statements and whatever, don't ever be fooled by that, because there will never be any. The Russia and Chinese leadership both remember all too well that the key, I mean, there's not just one reason, but the one reason, that's foremost, probably among all the others, in why the Cold War ended as is viewed as, a victory for the West, right, and ended in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is because of the way the U.S. exploited the Sino-Soviet split. Right, which goes back. And when Kissinger and Nixon came up with this, Kissinger himself said, in 20 years, we'll have to play it the other way around and side with the Russians against China. Right? He said that outright. And he was perfectly right. I mean, in a realist view of the world, a balancing of great powers. Right. But we had the hegemonic moment, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the hegemonic moment, and now Russia and China have realized that their fates and the fate of the multipolar world are intrinsically tied together. So that is just the level of, we all know the level of delusion that the Kiev regime and that the European leaders are operating under. Where when they complained to Hegseth about the U.S. making concessions to Russia, right, meaning saying that Ukraine was never going to join NATO and that they were never going to be able to take back all of Ukraine's territory for the Kiev regime, that was some type of concession to Russia before negotiations ever began. And Hegseth replied, no, that's just reality.
Yeah.
That's just a realistic assessment of where things are now, which infuriated them, because they would rather live in their delusional fantasy world where if they just hold out for another 3 months, the Russian economy will collapse, or whatever hopium they've been holding on to for the last 3 years. But now we see the hopium that the Trump administration is in, that suddenly Russia and the United States can become bosom buddies and take on China together, which is an even greater delusion, right? Let's be clear about that.
I want to play your clip since you brought that up. Trump, in one of his meetings, points out it would be great to have trilateral talks between Putin and Xi Jinping. And again, I applaud all this, right? Like, the catch becomes, okay, well, what does this mean in practice? Not necessarily what these guys are just coming up out of their minds with, but I want to get your take on it.
One of the first meetings I want to have is with President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia. And I want to say, let's cut our military budget in half. And we can do that. And I think we'll be able to do it.
What are your thoughts on that? This idea of,
I always think the U.S. could still cut its military budget in half, and it would still be much larger than Russia and China put together. So, I mean, after this conflict is settled, the Russian military budget is going to drop dramatically to begin with, right? The Russian military budget, depending on how you count it, is up from about 3% of GDP to 10 to 12% of GDP, wow. Right? Which is significant, right? But it's also not what you hear people trying to talk that the Russian economy is on a war footing, right? It's a war economy. Like, they're comparing it to the economies of World War II, where the U.S. was spending 40% of its GDP on military production. Okay. No, it's nowhere. There's a world of economic difference between 10 to 12% and 40%. Just saying, right? Mm-hmm. So no, the Russian economy is not on a war footing in that way, meaning at a sacrifice of the civilian economy. Obviously, there's big Russian military production ramp up, right? With Mark Rutte admitting again and again, outproducing all of NATO put together by 3 times. But it has not come at the sacrifice of the civilian economy. Instead, the civilian economy has actually been galvanized by the increase in the military spending, and many argue has grown not just in spite of Western sanctions on Russia, but specifically because of them. Right, which is one of the reasons why there's lots of people in Russia that probably will not be so eager to see sanctions go away. They don't, want Western goods flooding back into their country when they've just, started really the process of building up a whole number of Russian industries that had atrophied after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that they're now making plenty of money on meeting domestic demand. So, that's an open question. But I mean, it depends. When Trump is making statements like that, first of all, when he's talking about, Russia, China, and the U.S. meeting and deciding things, right? He is talking about a concert of what he identifies as the operable great powers now. Notice that he's not including Europe. He's not including the EU among those great powers. And don't think that Europe doesn't recognize that fact. But I mean, if he thinks that Russia and China are going to give up their militaries, because Trump, is it in a sudden, we're ending up on the short end of this whole new arms race here thing. He's wrong. I mean, Russia now has the most hardened, combat experienced military in the world. they're not going to just say, "Oh, we don't need that anymore," and shelve it, right? They're going to, to sit on it as a new deterrent, as a new, and there's of course the potential for using it if things go south, right, with NATO. But they're not just going to give up. But in 4 years, less than 4 years now, start the clock, at a minimum, if he survives that long, Trump is gone, right? And we see how dramatic a change there has been already in 3 weeks between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, right? Let's say someone in the mold of Chuck Schumer wins the new U.S. election in 4 more years, because Americans are quixotic that way and often flip, right? If J.D. Vance continues, right, that's maybe a different story, but Russia and China can't count on that, right?
Right.
They have to, even if Trump means everything he says and his own administration lets him do it, neither of which are certainties. In 4 years, he's out and another U.S. president is in, and Russia and China need to think not just in terms of the next 4 years, although to be certain, they will doubtless try to exploit those 4 years of internal chaos in the U.S. as much as they can, and they should do that. But they have to make plans for what happens after Trump, right? Not that that's even possible to make plans for Trump right now, because no one knows really what's going on. No one